A little satire news publication founded in Wisconsin in 1988 is still going strong 35 years later. My next guest was an original staff member of The Onion from 1988 to 1990. And now Christine Wenc is out with this new book, Funny Because It's True, How The Onion Created Modern American News Satire. And Christine has an author event tonight at the Elliott Bay Book Company. But first, you're here on our couch. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so did you have any idea back in 1988 when you started at The Onion that it would turn into what it has today?
Yeah, no, I don't think anybody imagined that it would become what it's become today. But there was something about the vibe at that time, though. I was just talking to Tim Keck, who's the founder of The Onion, last night and lives in Seattle now. About how there was just something in the air, and I think the Onion kind of tapped into something, and it grew from there. But we had no idea. I mean, it was a bunch of undergraduates, doing something in their spare time.
So fun. And what were the requirements back then to be hired by the original The Onion?
Oh, well, at that time it was basically like your friend or your roommate or, the guy who worked at the liquor store who wrote funny signs in the windows kind of thing. It was very much, like just friends of friends, yeah.
God, that would have been such a fun place to work then when you really feel like a family and you're all friends, I imagine.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. The very first year was different from the later years. Tim sold it and actually came to Seattle to start The Stranger. So there was an interesting Seattle connection. The first year of The Onion, including me, I was one of the first editors of The Stranger, moved to Seattle and did that, but the people who stayed behind were the people who kind of made The Onion into what we think of The Onion as being now.
Gosh, yeah. And The Onion's motto is, "You are dumb." Explain that.
Yeah, it's funny because I knew about the motto. It was a little bit after my time, and I always thought, well, that's not a very nice motto, know? But I realized that what they're pointing out is it's more about the stupidity of humanity and the stupidity of not pointing out, I think, like injustice and cruelty and that sort of thing, and so it's kind of a classic satire trope, to kind of make fun of the human condition. But it also, because if as the way The Onion's history played out, it's also we know all the stories of people thinking Onion stories were true, and all the fake news problems that we have now. So like it kind of is a comment on all that stuff too.
Yeah, and do you think that being a member of Generation X, called the first generation, expected to do worse than their parents, made it possible to publish something like The Onion in the early days? Yeah. I mean, there's I kind of described the scene in Madison in the late 80s and 1990s, and there was a feeling that, well, if your future is, doesn't look like it's going to be that great, you can kind of do whatever you want. It's sort of freeing in a way, and so people were doing all kinds of creative and cool stuff in Madison, and The Onion was just one of them. Yeah. And how has The Onion's history, paralleled the history of real news? You touched on this.
Yeah. So this book is also sort of a stealth history of media and the news since the late 80s. And because The Onion has been satirizing the news in all its different forms since then, and it's very, very good at kind of exactly reproducing the sort of tropes and structure and like how things are put together. But I wanted to look at not just what those changes were, but why and how. So I sort of touch on that like through the whole book. Like, what was The Onion satirizing this whole time, and why were they doing it?
And how has The Onion's content changed over the years too, as this has just gone on?
Yeah. So it started out as a weekly print newspaper, right? Because that's what was happening at the time. And then when the internet came in the mid-90s, The Onion was one of the earliest humor sites on the internet and just exploded in 1996. And then they moved their editorial office to New York City, and then after that they started, as new media came in, as social media began, they had one of the earliest humor Twitter feeds and that kind of thing. They also were really early to web video when this was happening in like 2007, 2008, sort of the early YouTube era, and they did some amazing work with the Onion News Network. And now with their new owners, as of last year, they've actually brought back the print edition, which is really interesting. So now it's interesting because they're sort of not the only people that are sort of playing around with print again. So the Onion tends to be like kind of on the forefront of these changes.
It sounds like it, and like pushing the envelope.
Yeah,
always.
no, absolutely, absolutely.
What do you think made the biggest difference at the Onion? Like, is there any favorite writers you have? Any legends you could talk about?
Oh my goodness, there are so many of them. It was so fun doing this because I get to talk to all of these people, not just old friends from Madison, but later generations of people. That 1990s crew, though, which I wasn't part of that group, but I knew some of them. People like Todd Hansen, editor Rob Siegel, writer Carol Kolb, that whole crew that's on the cover of the book. Those folks were really, really, really important and instrumental in creating the Onion's satiric voice in the 90s when it was. It was kind of they were sort of the only people who were doing it at that time, and so they really kind of created this genre.
Gosh, so cool. And were there any instances that you can think of where you feel like the Onion may have crossed a line?
Yeah, there's been a few, for sure. Yeah, for sure. There's one I describe in the book involves Weird Al Yankovic.
That makes sense.
Yeah, who's actually been a friend of the Onion for a long time. He let me do like a little email interview with him, but I was actually appalled by this when I found out about this story. His parents died tragically in a carbon monoxide poisoning accident, and the Onion, there's a writer at the Onion who wrote the Onion's horoscopes, and Weird Al had taken the Onion horoscopes and sort of made them into a song, and I guess this writer didn't feel like they got enough credit, and so they wrote in sort of with tasteless revenge, wrote a story, but in the book I allow them to apologize to Weird Al. So,
there we go. Thank you so much for being here. Fascinating.
Thanks for having me.
And just a reminder, Christine is holding an author event tonight, Tuesday the 6th at 7 p.m. at the Elliott Bay Book Company.